The lingering mystery of the Alex Murdaugh murder trial. The trial of the South Carolina lawyer Alex Murdaugh for the murder of his wife, Maggie, and his son Paul, was expected to last 3 weeks, but instead went on for 6. It was a fittingly epic finale to the protracted downfall of Murdaugh, the scion of a prominent legal dynasty, whose saga involved embezzlement, drug trafficking, money laundering, a faked murder attempt, a failed assisted suicide, and the deaths of 3 other individuals. It was also a fittingly theatrical spectacle, echoing the rest of the Murdaugh story with its notes of high tragedy, low farce, and macabre horror. In the course of the trial, someone called in a bomb threat. A defense lawyer pointed a rifle at the prosecution, while proffering theories of how the shootings had occurred. 2 jurors were knocked out by COVID-19 and 2 more owing to other medical problems. A 5th was removed on the last day for discussing the case outside court. As she was sent on her way, she told the judge she'd left a dozen eggs in the jury room, providing a rare moment of comic relief. There were exchanges about the trajectory of evacuated brains that might have come out of Breaking Bad, and others, more reminiscent of Gone with the Wind, with family retainers, talking of Miss Maggie and Mr. Alex, and extravagantly decorous mamming and sirring all round. We heard a great deal about the Murdaugh family's hunting estate, Moselle, with its doe fields and quail pens, its swamps full of hogs and forests full of deer, its shotguns, pistols, and semi-automatic rifles so numerous that their owners had long lost count. Over strenuous objections from the defense, we also heard how Murdaugh had stolen vast sums of money from colleagues, family, and the victims he'd represented as a personal injury lawyer. The judge had ruled these crimes admissible on the ground that they were relevant to his alleged motive for the murders. Faced with ruin from the imminent exposure of his frauds and thefts, the prosecution's theory went, Murdaugh had decided that the only way to save himself was to become a victim. Sympathy for a bereaved husband and father would supplant the gathering storm of suspicion, and the murders themselves could be attributed to threats that Paul had received after allegedly causing the death of a young woman, Mallory Beach, in a boat crash in 2019. What we didn't hear much about during the trial was Murdaugh's cousin Eddie, the alleged shooter in Murdaugh's botched assisted suicide, and his possible accomplice in narcotics schemes that both men have been charged with. Aside from some dark hints in the defense's opening statements, we didn't hear much about the violent drug traffickers with whom Murdaugh supposedly fell into debt after Eddie cheated them. Eddie's lawyers deny claims that Eddie cheated anyone or skimmed any of this money. We didn't hear what role Eddie or the traffickers played, if any, in the defense's theory that there were 2 shooters. And we heard nothing at all about the failed polygraph test that Murdaugh's attorneys had made public before the trial, in which Eddie was asked if he had been present at the murders or knew anything about them. Nor did we hear as much as some would have liked about the brown hair found in Maggie Murdaugh's hand, or the unidentified DNA recovered from under her fingernail. Unlike the spectators crammed into the Walterboro courtroom, those of us following the trial online couldn't see the jury. But we did have the advantage of live commentary from the likes of Nancy Grace and O.J. Simpson. "I do think this guy more than likely did it," Simpson said in a video posted on Twitter, along with the usual spate of inventively tasteless memes. "I roll gifs, me watching Alex Murdaugh cry," and florid misinformation. John Grisham was not, in fact, present in the courtroom. We heard from experts, some accredited, most self-appointed, on body language, prison prepping, and the criminal mind. Every attorney was appraised for legal effectiveness and for entertainment value. Fans of the goateed-led prosecutor, Creighton Waters, posted videos of him rocking out in his former life as the lead guitarist of the cover band Soul Purpose. During the defense's closing arguments, the incredulous facial expressions of the prosecutor, Savannah Gowd, went viral. For all the circus surrounding the trial, the fact is that 2 people were brutally murdered, and a 3rd was facing the possibility of life behind bars. The case against Murdaugh was based entirely on circumstantial evidence. Much of it gleaned from the treacherous surveillance technology of cars and phones. For anyone who could follow it, the telemetry-related testimony was a sobering lesson in the extent to which our devices are watching us, and also the degree to which modern forensics can penetrate into the finest crevices of past events. Out of the massive data that prosecutors harvested, they were able to create a detailed timeline of the fateful night at Moselle. Almost every step that the 3 family members took, every inch traveled and action performed in their vehicles, every repositioning of their phones was accounted for. Whether the accounting was as accurate as prosecutors suggested, or as unambiguous in its implications, was another matter. The defense tried to advance its 2-shooter theory early in the trial, using data from Maggie's and Murdaugh's phones to make a plausible case that someone other than Murdaugh must have thrown Maggie's phone into the woods where it was later found. Other attempts to undermine the credibility of the investigation by the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, SLED, were aided by some clear blunders on the division's part. The most notable were an internal fiasco involving a claim that they'd found high-velocity spatter on Murdaugh's shirt, which was later walked back, though not before the state grand jury had indicted Murdaugh for the murders, and an inexplicable failure to make a timely search of Murdaugh's parents' property, to which he drove after the shootings, and where may have stowed the two murder weapons, before hiding them irretrievably. Police finally searched the place 3 months later. Law enforcement also made far too much of a muffled phrase spoken by Murdaugh in one of his police interviews, which some people claimed to hear as "I did him so bad," referring to his son, but which others heard as "they did him so bad." Whichever it was, it hardly bolstered their portrayal of Murdaugh as a cold-blooded family annihilator to insist that he'd blurted out a confession like some conscience-stricken low-country Raskolnikov. But the prosecution had one piece of incontrovertible and deeply damning evidence, namely a video clip found on Paul's phone, that captured Murdaugh's voice near the kennels, where his wife and son were shot, placing him at the scene of the crime, in the narrow window of the victim's likely times of death. The video, of a friend's dog, featured nothing more sinister than a raucous little family drama in the background, involving the rescue of a chicken from the jaws of the family's own dog Bubba. But it proved Murdaugh to be a liar. He told police in 3 separate interviews that he hadn't gone down to the kennels with Maggie and Paul that night and fatally compromised his alibi. It was almost certainly this video that prompted Murdaugh to make the decision to take the stand in his own defense. As a lawyer, he would have known the risks this entailed, but there was no other way to address his inconvenient lie. He did so by blaming it on paranoid thoughts caused by his opioid addiction, which he said had exacerbated an already deep distrust of SLED. In essence, he claimed to have been afraid that, if he admitted to being at the kennels, the police would pin the murders on him, without looking for the real killers. This narrative had a certain glib cleverness, but, given that Murdaugh had already been exposed as a manipulator accustomed to swindling vulnerable people, glib cleverness was not a helpful note to strike. Murdaugh was more convincing when it came to his feelings for Paul and Maggie, whom he described with a detailed vividness that conveyed real love, at least until his habit of referring to them and others by their pet names Mags, Paw began to cloy. Jurors later revealed that they'd found him rehearsed, as did many online commenters. The Oscars jibes proliferated. Even if you were convinced of his love for Mags and Paw, Murdaugh failed to undo the damage done by his lie, and possibly made it worse. On top of that, he gave Waters, the lead prosecutor, an opportunity to grill him directly about his financial crimes, which he did mercilessly. Thereafter, Murdaugh's defense team seemed to fall apart. Jim Griffin, whose deceptively mild manner had worked to great effect earlier on, gave a strange, stammering performance in his closing argument, inexplicably referring to the not-proven verdict that jurors in Scotland are allowed to reach, as if all but conceding his client's guilt. Matters were made worse by a spectacularly fiery rebuttal from the prosecutor John Meters, who deployed to lethal effect the irresistible trope of Paul the Little Detective, as his family sometimes called him, testifying, via his cell phone footage, from the grave. At the start of deliberations, 2 jurors believed that Murdaugh was innocent, and a third was undecided. They apparently had their minds easily changed, and the jury delivered a unanimous verdict of guilty on all counts in less than 3 hours. This struck some as a little hasty, especially given that the trial was among the longest in South Carolina history. Certainly no plausible culprit besides Murdaugh ever emerged, and the evidence against him was powerfully persuasive. But for some observers, myself included, the alleged motive behind the crime strained belief. Would a functional, albeit opioid-addicted, middle-aged man blast his 22-year-old son in the chest and head with a shotgun, and then gun down his wife of 3 decades with 5 bullets from a semi-automatic .300 blackout, within a few minutes of chattering with them about Bubba and the chicken, just in the hope of warding off an approaching storm of legal troubles? Justice may have been served, but the human element of the story didn't seem to add up. Both at the trial and beyond, attempts were made to resolve this dissonance, mostly by fitting Murdaugh into one of various criminological categories: sociopath, narcissist, family annihilator. But it was an extraordinary set of musing remarks from the judge, Clifton Newman, that occasioned the only real moment of illumination, not because they offered a satisfying explanation, but because they somehow released us from the need for one. As he summoned Murdaugh to the bench for sentencing last Friday, Newman acknowledged the depth of the defendant's feelings for his wife and son, offering something approaching compassion for a man whom he predicted would henceforth be haunted each night by the people he had loved and killed. He observed that, in his 22 years as a judge, he had yet to encounter a single convicted murderer who could go back to that moment in time when they decided to pull the trigger ... and explain to me what happened. Murdaugh, he seemed to suggest, was as much a mystery to himself as he was to the rest of us, and the appropriate response to his fate was not the knowing superiority of online cheerleaders, but terror and pity at the destruction he had wrought. Handing down 2 consecutive life sentences, which Murdaugh surely deserves, the judge left us with an image of the former lawyer alone with his demons, as he had been that night in Marseille, immured in a state of denial thicker and more unbreachable than any prison walls.